Oh yes, my second favourite dungeon of all time, and choosing between this and Stone Tower took a lot more thinking than you can ever imagine. But what the Spirit Temple slightly lacks in puzzles, it makes up for 10 times over in atmosphere, originality, and incredible concepts.
Remember guys, these are still not immune to criticism even in part 5. No dungeon is perfect, not ever. No worries, there's no more negativity from my side, you can relax now. But if you don't like these following dungeons, that's completely okay. Everything's subjective. I completely respect your views as a Zelda player. The Spirit Temple is my second favorite temple from Ocarina of Time, just barely trailing behind the Fire Temple, and man, does it know how to cement the definition of ambiance in your face. The moment you walk in here, you can feel the music start fumbling with your soul and fills up your nostalgia pretty stinking close to the brim. Out of all the music I've heard in Ocarina of Time, the Spirit Temple music is still something that holds up in a league of its own today by my standards, even though I played this game quite a bit. As everyone knows, this temple is split into entering this dungeon as a child and an adult. By reflecting back on playing Ocarina of Time the first time, I remember being impressed with the innovation of being a child again to getting the first half done because it's so unexpected. But you also wonder about your Ocarina of Time journey, how things have changed between tackling Lord Jabu Jabu's belly and having been to all of the adult dungeons, and between reaching this one, and it's definitely something to reflect back on. Now comes my small negative, but it's not big at all, but it's good to explain why I pulled it down a bit. I felt the child Link is outdated and a little finicky to control after being adult Link a lot lately. Using Deku Sticks and a boomerang is a nice way to remind yourself how far you've come since back then, but it does feel as though those mechanics are outdated when you compare it to things like the bow, the long shot, the hover boots, and I missed my big Goron sword or holding up the Hylian shield properly as an adult. It's not a big downhill at all, as I think the charm of using Child Link still holds up magnificently, but I think it's appropriate to bring up the positives and negatives of every dungeon. The puzzles are fantastic. They're plentiful and go over a lot of items you've been collecting throughout the game, including some new toys to play with like Bomb Chews and the Mirror Shield to keep the originality going, which is an incredible way to bring everything together, and how Link has been developing into a hero, and to conclude the game with its last main dungeon. I think I've covered everything, and when you sit back and think about how the overall package went, this is pretty darn impressive. Think about it, this is the first 3D Zelda game they've experimented on, so everything could have gone wrong from the get-go when booting up the game. It's impressive enough that they got the execution of the game right as a whole, but to wrap everything up into a nice package like this to something this memorable, and leave us with the conclusion this impressive after everything we've seen, it's no wonder it's number 4. It's the best voted final dungeon on this list. You know what I meant. I meant the last dungeon before the showdown at the castle of a Zelda game.
Where do I even begin with this place? It took everything that the Forest Temple did great, mysterious atmosphere, incredibly fitting music and unique puzzles, and added a brilliant new item, the Mirror Shield, that would later get incorporated to other great dungeons like Wind Waker's Earth Temple, a unique charm including indoor and outdoor areas that gave it a lot of personality. Not to mention, you visit it as both a child and an adult. This was so awesome. I'm really surprised they didn't use this concept more, as it would have made Ocarina of Time even more amazing, in my opinion anyway. Shame Jitten isn't a huge fan though, no matter how much I try and persuade him. Is it just me, or do all of these dungeons in part 5 so far seem to have one disliker out of the 4 of us? Well, I guess if you've been watching up to here, you guys will know that no two opinions are the same. Back to the dungeon itself, well, what is there to say? Not only was it in itself great, but it also came around at the perfect time for me. Basically, imagine you're a 12 or 13-year-old kid. You've put in over 20 hours of Ocarina of Time. You've never finished a 3D Zelda game before. I mean, the furthest you've ever gotten is the Master Sword in Wind Waker. So you're almost at the end of your journey. You're super excited, as you can imagine. You started off with the child dungeons. They stumped you in points, but they never really gave you a great deal of hassle. Then you run into the Temple of Time, ready to pull out the legendary Master Sword, ready to save the world, and bam! 5 more huge, harder dungeons are thrown in your face. You struggle through the Forest Temple. It takes you 2 hours, but you make it. Fire, water, and shadow were tricky, but ultimately satisfying. You reach the entrance to your final dungeon just as school ends and your Easter holiday starts. It couldn't have been a better time. I was in a great mood, and I fully appreciated everything the Spirit Temple offered, taking everything in. As I said, the child-adult concept, awesome, as well as basically everything else for me. A wonderful place in itself, with every good aspect of a dungeon included, but the time of year just made it even better. The Spirit Temple is what packaged Ocarina of Time as something truly great for me. And while I'm eternally torn on whether I prefer it over Majora's Mask, this temple is something that really pushes me in Ocarina of Time's favour. If the Spirit Temple didn't exist, I might not even have thought twice about which game I prefer. It's the reason I like Ocarina of Time as much as I do, and it's also the reason I'll probably never make a top 10 favourite Zelda games.
Do you guys have any idea how different the last part of this list could have ended up? To put this into perspective, if any one of us out of the 4 of us moved any of these 4 dungeons on the ranks just one place up or one place down under the circumstances, this entire video would have changed. But now, the last of the 4 that won the battle, the City in the Sky.
My Lanayru mining facility is many people's City in the Sky. I hated the mining facility music and the first impression it gave me, but the dungeon, not the music, gradually seemed to get better for me as you progressed, especially once you started activating the timeshift zones. This is how quite a few people felt about City in the Sky. The music wasn't so much bad as a bit annoying and unnerving, and some people just found it flat out annoying. Jitten. Not to mention, I know a few people that weren't so sure about this place too. A temple in the sky seemed a bit weird, and the branching paths seemed to make it more confusing than it needed to be. Then, as you started getting to know the dungeon, you worked out where every path went, and it all started to come together. Just like mining facility, the further I went into this dungeon, the more I seemed to like it. I'm not really sure how to explain it, but think of it this way. Was there ever a food or drink that you didn't like when you first tried it, but the more you had it, the better it seemed to become? And this is what I think the City in the Sky can be compared to. It's a place that I just wanted to end at first and never try again, like a drink that I hated when I first tried it. Then it began to grow on me, and by the end, it was one of my all-time favourite dungeons in the series. About a third of the way through the dungeon, I was just beginning to enjoy this place, and then they hit you with my all-time favourite Zelda item, the double claw shots. Having one was brilliant enough, but being able to hang onto one wall and latch onto another at the same time was beyond awesome at the time, and it only got better once they came back in Skyward Sword. I guess this dungeon has a parallel with Skyward Sword as well. You could fill a bucket with the number of floors in it, confusing beginning, arguably annoying music, and one incredibly cheap Switch placement to name but a few of City in the Sky's problems. But some people were much more bothered by them than others. It's just how opinions work, and ours, as well as yours, are all fine. I really like this place, but if you don't, I can certainly see why. However, this isn't a list where every opinion of every part of the dungeon is the same, as you well know by now. I do have one complaint about City in the Sky, and it's one that I don't think I've ever seen any other Zelda player complain about in this dungeon. I simply don't like how this place looks. I'm not a big fan of how bland the wall textures are, and I don't like how everything just looks so similar. As Jason said with the ancient system, preferences on art style vary from person to person. I didn't like how the grass looked in this dungeon or any of Twilight Princess. If this dungeon had just added more variety in terms of its looks, I would have enjoyed this place even more, but luckily, the rest of the dungeon is of such a high standard that my complaints about the art style in this dungeon didn't stop it from being fantastic in itself. Before we move on, I'd just like to say something about Twilight Princess itself. I've mentioned this a few times already, but I'm not the hugest fan of it. What frustrates me most about the game is how much wasted potential there was. It was really long, but if they'd just taken out the Tears of Light completely and removed some of the annoying padding like the late game statue quest and the Reekfish fetch parts, a good number of this game's problems would have been solved for me. But what annoys me even more is how fantastic the dungeons in themselves were, and I think it's one of the only Zelda games where I like being in a dungeon much more than exploring the overworld. Twilight Princess was chock full of masterful dungeons, and in my opinion, this was one of them.
I turned down the music really low to let mine and Joe's voices drown it out because it's music that, like the Lanayru mining facility, it can be irritating for some. I couldn't find any remixes or any other fitting music for it, and I considered the Hidden Village music just before the City in the Sky, but a western piece doesn't really substitute a sky piece at all. However popular and cool that music is in its setting, it's just not meant for here. Believe it or not, this is actually going to be the hardest dungeon for me to talk about in this series. It's because it's hard to pin things down to what makes it so great, and there are a lot of things going on for interpretation, but more on that in a minute. But right now, I'm going to take you back to what surprises me the most about the dungeon, and what's the best part for me personally. After you beat the Temple of Time, as per usual, the game leaves you hints here and there about where to find the next dungeon that's going to be found in some unknown area you're going to explore. But after the Temple of Time, everybody kept talking about the sky. And then Midna started to say that the mirror shard was in the heavens, meaning the sky, and I was like, that's not possible. Remember that Skyward Sword hasn't come out yet, and I haven't played Minish Cap that came out directly before Twilight Princess at the time, so I was fascinated with this. How is Link going to get to a location miles into the air when he's never left the ground in a Zelda game? It just blew my mind into wet glue, and I don't think I've ever paid attention to text boxes like never before in a Zelda game in my life. So fast forward past getting back Ilia's memory and fixing the cannon, and boom! Here we are. There is a floating pile of runes miles in the sky in a Zelda game. Can you wrap your head around that? Because I sure couldn't. And then comes the next part. What's inside it? What's around? Just what the heck is this place? It was the shock value that made this place so memorable for me. But let's move on, because we're talking about the dungeon, not before it. Now this is probably the hardest dungeon to talk about in this series for me, because it runs off with so many ideas that it's hard to figure out what the dungeon is nailing down in its execution here. Look at this. Idea 1. It takes using animals like it did with the monkeys from the Forest Temple. Idea 2. It uses powerful scenery and environmental effects like the Goron mines with the wind. Idea 3. It uses obscure paths like the Lakebed Temple to get around, meaning the place is a maze. Idea 4. It uses traps like the Arbutus Grounds with the collapsible tiles and narrow paths. Idea 5. The temple's origins are a mystery like the Snow Peak ruins, which gives it its intriguing landscape and origins. I mean, there's birds here, and they don't have hands to build this place, so who built it and what's it doing here floating spontaneously in the sky? Idea 6. There are several floors and it's a huge spacious dungeon like the Temple of Time. You see the pattern? The city in the sky is making a salad out of what makes every dungeon in Twilight Princess stand out from the 6 contenders, making it really yummy to eat if you like a little sampling of everything, which is something I enjoy and apparently the rest of us do really well. But on the downside, that is throwing together so many concepts together at once, and now picking one to sit down with is a little intimidating and confusing for some Zelda players on what this dungeon is trying to do. From the 4 of us, and to add on the positives, is that it has its own original idea with the item that the 4 of us, me, Joe, Jitten, and Warren, agreed was the coolest item in the Zelda series, and that's the double claw shot. Admit it, you were daydreaming about being Link every day for the next few days after the dungeon was done. It's irresistibly awesome. Before I close, I should still say that the dungeon still isn't perfect. In fact, out of the 7 dungeons on this part, well, it's 4 now because we split part 5 in half to make part 6 here, this is the one I hear the most complaints about. And it's usually the music, and you know what? That's a reasonable complaint. It's hard to enjoy a dungeon if there's a dungeon music piece nagging at your ears, so nope, the dungeon isn't for everyone. And as we heard from Joe as well, the landscape isn't something he'd put up as a favorite part of this dungeon. I'm sure there are other complaints out there, but if I launched it to my number 5 spot, then I can only speak for myself and what makes it work for me, and only for me. It set it up great, it started great, it flowed great, and it finished great. It soared high in my books.
I think you already know this, but I think that Twilight Princess had some pretty fantastic dungeons. One thing that I noticed about the majority of this final part's dungeons is that they've had very original concepts, often deviating from the regular find keys, unlock doors formula. Well, get your snowballs ready, guys, because Snow Peak Ruins is not only one of the most unique locations in the series, it was brilliant because of it.
I don't play Zelda entirely for the dungeons, but what the Snow Peak Ruins does is what I entirely love from Zelda better than any dungeon out there. True, it may be a dungeon, but it executes what I think does best that Zelda does for my taste and what I come back for the series for. Surprises. What happens in Zelda? You get surprised a lot. The graphics change from game to game, you explore new areas, and guess what? You go to dungeons, find them, then get surprised with what awaits you inside with the item, the environment, the layout, and the boss of the dungeon. It's different every time, and that's why I love the series. So you head to the top of the mountain and find a Yeti. A surprise. You find out he's friendly. A surprise compared to normal monsters you find. He invites you to his mansion. Another surprise. And then you snowboard down the mountain in a race against him. Another surprise. You get the picture, but the Snow Peak Ruins feels like it compounds so many of these surprises together that it honestly feels like the complete adventure compared to any other moment from the series entirely. The first part is wandering through the mostly abandoned mansion. At that, it isn't technically a dungeon hidden in something from the natural environment, but instead in a more homemade environment, which rarely happens, at which, like the city in the sky, it gives more depth to the mysteriousness which extends itself past the usual dungeon. There are cannons set up all over the place, and the entire place is encased in ice, meaning there is a large history and that the place tells a story. Even though we won't be able to figure it out, it's the friendly question marks like the city in the sky that gives it its unbelievable charm. The second part is the antics with Yeto and Yetta, with each Yeti having a personality and story that contributes to the immersion of the dungeon. With Yetta, she gets sick with being in contact with the mirror shard and tries to guide you in finding the bedroom key to get to the shard. But because of her getting sick to remember properly, you find soup ingredients for Yeto instead, at which, like I said, a big chunk of genuine surprise. Which, as I said, makes a big jump in why I love the dungeon so much. Yeto's friendliness at the beginning to get invited inside of the mansion, and with his jumpy responses when you bring him ingredients in the kitchen is a nice touch, honestly. The third part is that because it's a mansion with different rooms and the outdoor areas in the middle, there's a complexity with the layout. No two rooms are hardly similar and adds a layer of fun to the entire experience. Even though the dungeon is admittedly smaller than the usual dungeon, it's revisiting through some of the same areas trying to go for different objectives, like the soup ingredients, trying to break some of the ice walls with the cannons, transferring cannonballs from one room to the next, or reaching the bedroom itself. As I said, to me personally, it feels interwoven to the adventure connected to this dungeon. And my last and final reason is ice. Everyone has environments that naturally appeal to some, and then there are those that we each don't like seeing. With me, I don't like formal dungeons like Temple of Time or the Ancient Cistern. And well, guess what my top 2 dungeons happen to be from my favorite 3D Zelda game? The Water Dungeon and the Ice Dungeon. Both of them elements I extremely like. While Lakebed fulfilled my difficulty cravings to the max with the Snow Peak Ruins trailing behind it in that game, I am not holding back in saying that Snow Peak Ruins is the best dungeon I've ever played in the 3D Zelda games. Just barely behind Lakebed Temple. When I was putting together my top 18 personal Zelda dungeons, I took forever deciding which of these two are better. Lakebed has its difficulty in water, and Snow Peak Ruins has its surprises I praised it for and the ice. I still consider them both pretty much the same in terms of being the greatest dungeons I've ever played from the entire series.
Snow Peak Ruins, along with the rest of all Twilight Princess's dungeons, is incredibly unique, and in this case, it definitely paid off. Even entering this place was cool, snowboarding down a mountain you just climbed up, only to find a so-called dungeon at the bottom. While a few other dungeons in the game may have had a backstory to them, this place was its own little story in itself. The relationship between Yeto and Yeto was really heartwarming, and, spoiler alert, it truly was a shocking moment when Yeto turned into the monster Blizzetta. Just look at this! A personal anecdote of Jitin's is watching his older brother play it when the game first came out in 2006. He was still pretty small at the time. Suffice to say, he didn't play Twilight Princess for a while after that. I don't really remember much about this place, but what I do remember is that the soup idea was something that could have been a staple in the game and I wouldn't have minded. Travelling to the centre to eat soup was just as good as finding recovery hearts for me, and it would have been even better had you not had to travel all the way to the same place every time you needed a refill. Still, it's an idea that wouldn't hurt to be used again. Now, I've said that Twilight Princess is a game of good and bad in my opinion, and I really mean that. While the previous entry, City in the Sky, looked the worst in the game for me, Snow Peak Ruins without a doubt looked the best. While City in the Sky had almost no variety in terms of art and textures, Snow Peak Ruins had masses, and the reason that's even more impressive is that the entire dungeon takes place in just one mansion. It was this and all the little touches, like the paintings on the wall, the fact that your item is the one that the mini-boss was just using against you, among many other things, that made Snow Peak Ruins so impressive for me. Sometimes it's the smaller things that end up having the biggest impacts. On an unrelated note, the ball and chain was a fantastic item, and I'm pretty sad that it hasn't been used since. It's probably the most satisfying item in the whole series to use. It's like that feeling of hitting Coloctus with his own sword whenever you want. Snow Peak Ruins was a pretty masterful place. All that's left now is number 1, and those of you who've been following this list know exactly what it is. And I doubt it'll come as much of a surprise. Let's roll.
Guess what? This reached all of our top 10s. Arbutus Grounds made our general number 1 dungeon. But is it perfect? Not by a long shot. I've got quite a few things to say about it. Hey, I'm a pro and con guy. I'm not really the type to think anything is perfect just because of nostalgia. But amongst the 4 of us, it's clearly the best. So, on to Arbutus Grounds and our last dungeon.
I bet a whole lot of you saw this one coming. There are very few other dungeons that could have realistically taken the number 1 spot. The Arbutus Grounds has been a fan favourite ever since Twilight Princess came out, and come to think of it, Twilight Princess got all of the top 3 here, didn't it? I'd say that's pretty impressive to say the least. Back to the dungeon itself, wow. What can I even say? Hyrule Castle may have had a good atmosphere, the Spirit Temple may have given off a great desert vibe, but neither equal what Arbutus Grounds does. Whatever makes a dungeon good, Arbutus Grounds seems to do it. Effective atmosphere? Check. An original idea? Check. A good item? Check on so many levels. The spinner, while utterly useless after the dungeon was finished, was so much fun while it lasted, and if it never gets used in Zelda games again, I will be so disappointed. Those of you who like the posed torches idea from Ocarina of Time's Forest Temple will love this. Imagine it with much creepier pose, more inventive puzzles, and a great introduction to the ability to change into a wolf whenever you want. And that's before you get the spinner. Once you do, the dungeon is a plethora of even cooler puzzles, an amazing main room with loads of places to have fun with your new item, and a brilliant end boss to boot. If bosses were being taken into account here, I very much doubt Star-Lord would have changed the position of this place. When I was talking to Jason about this game, he specifically mentioned this as being the highlight, and in his words, a great beginning to what was, in my opinion, easily the better half of the game. As Jason said, the Arbutus Grounds was the only dungeon to reach the top 10 in all of our lists, and it's easy to see why. Twilight Princess may not even be close to my favourite Zelda game, but you bet it has my favourite dungeons. Arbutus Grounds was creepy, it was unique, it was challenging, and most importantly, it was a whole lot of fun, and it was our favourite dungeon in the whole series.
You guys look so tense. Relax. I think number 4 means I have a lot of good things to say about it. First, let's cover the big weakness I think this dungeon has. Arbutus Grounds does have a weakness in my opinion. When you hear this, someone out there might retort, it doesn't have a weakness, it's perfect. While Arbutus Grounds is our general number 1 vote, nobody here put it as their all-time favorite dungeon, meaning the dungeon failed an expectation somewhere for each of us that prevented it from being the best dungeon for each of us. I can't speak for the other 3, but I can speak for myself. Let's recap. I played Twilight Princess through 3 times. The first time on the Wii, the second time on the GameCube, and the third time about a month ago. I can recall a handful of memorable rooms from each dungeon, because there's something about the item from the dungeon being used to great effect, or that the environment stands out in a certain way in those rooms to distinguish them one from the next. In Arbutus Grounds, the place is the most generic dungeon compared to any other Twilight Princess dungeon in my opinion. This is what I believe where the dungeon falls flat. One room looks the same as the next one. The flowing pits of sand looks exactly like the same as the flowing sand pits in the next room. The deformed platforms look the same as the deformed platforms in the next area. To prove this, I finished Twilight Princess a month ago, and I'm still scratching my head at what this place properly looks like at about 90% of the dungeon. I even had to look up footage to remember this place, at which I didn't do with any of the other places in Twilight Princess. Now you're asking, why am I bringing up a negative in the top of this list? It should be a time for me to celebrate on about how great this dungeon is. For 2 reasons. 1, it isn't very productive. If I say Arbutus Grounds is great, then you go to another Zelda dungeon countdown and see the Arbutus Grounds is great, then you go to a third one and the person says the Arbutus Grounds is great. How does being told the same thing and reasons about an entry benefit you? It's a redundant thing to do. Like every other countdown maker, I have my right to change things up to make things interesting for this list. The second reason is what I promised. every dungeon has pros and cons. I'm not really a gamer to say that everything is 100% perfect in the video game world, just because nostalgia tries to hypnotize me in thinking it's perfect, including the Arbutus Grounds. Everybody has their thing. Others think nostalgia takes priority, and that's fine. It creates a special attachment to video games, for both me and you, but it's not my driving force. I like being fair to both sides of the equation. Somebody has every right to hate the Arbutus Grounds as much as I do with the Ancient Cistern, so I like being fair to the minority and want to treat them like the majority. It's my driving force to be fair rather than let my nostalgia think other opinions are wrong. But enough with the cutesy stuff, now let's flip around to the positives. There is a massive reason that Arbutus Grounds is my number 4 dungeon. I think its strongest point is the amount of dedication they put into the environment compared to the other Twilight Princess dungeons that does it for me. Because everything looks so deformed, crooked, and ancient, it makes the dungeon 1,000 times more natural and fun to be in because of those little details. And I appreciate the developers doing that to immerse me into it. Just like the Shadow Temple with Dead Hand and the Ancient Cistern with the basement, scary things in Zelda get old really fast, especially if other game series I've played have done it far better in comparison, and the Arbutus Grounds is no exception. But I do appreciate with what they're going for here, and I'd say Arbutus Grounds nails it best with its atmosphere better than any other attempt, and props to that. It makes the dungeon much more real to be in. I'd say other than Goron Mines for my taste, Arbutus Grounds is my favorite atmosphere to be in, and I enjoyed it immensely. A nice touch I have to praise the dungeon for is the complexity of getting the wolf involved in digging out secret switches and sniffing out the ghosts with a post scent. It added to the overall variety of the puzzles and navigating to the dungeon, and to that, there's a nice layer of non-linearity here. Of course, I'm talking about the Forest Temple throwback and referring to the poor ghost concept reused in this game. So, the pros. Excellent atmosphere, fantastic engaging music, the little details, the thoughtful enemies, the dark areas, plenty of traps and interesting creatures around, the spinner was great, and even though the boss isn't counted, a great addition. There's a lot to go around, it's why it's my number 4 spot. The cons that kept it from number 1. It's too generic to remember rooms properly. Its scary theme, though fantastic and the number 1 dungeon for nailing it down, doesn't affect me like other Zelda players. And the spinner was hardly used at all in this dungeon. About 5 minutes if you know where you're going, and probably the item used the least amount compared to any other Twilight Princess dungeons with their items. Alright, I think that wraps it up in our collaboration. Joe's a fantastic guy, great to work with. Working with someone who can respect anyone's opinions as much as he can is a rare treat to see, and it's what I admire the most about him. It's time to go our separate ways, but I won't forget our time together, and the time we spent looking up the YouTube comments and interacting with you guys has been awesome. Joe has his fan-made list equivalent of this. Be sure to look it up because it'll close shortly after this video, and it's time I pulled out my special video as well. Since this is on my channel, I'll start working on the top 720 Pokemon by algorithm in weekly episodes, and it's time for me to start getting into other things other than Zelda. There are so many other great series out there that need to be explored, and I'm burning out. I think I've covered enough Zelda. With that, it's time to say farewell. I hope you enjoyed this list, and we'll both see you later. Ciao.